If she ever took a job like that again, she promised herself one thing: she would never stay quiet just to survive. Because what happened to her that week, the way they laughed behind her back, the way they made her feel small, was something no one deserved. And it didn't end with a meeting or an apology. It ended with her husband standing in the middle of the office, his name already on the building, and theirs being scratched off. But before we get there, tell me something. Where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments below. Because stories like this, they happen everywhere. And they always start quietly, just like this one. The building was cold, not in temperature but in atmosphere. Gray tile floors, soft halogen lights, the kind of polished minimalism that made everything feel replaceable. Even the people. Harper worked at a luxury branding agency called Leon. Everything had to be pronounced with flair. It wasn't a desk, it was a collaboration hub. It wasn't an ad team, it was a concept division. And it wasn't a job, it was a privilege. At least, that's what her manager repeated often enough to make people afraid to ask for breaks. Harper didn't belong there, not really. She didn't have the shiny resume, didn't come from a name-drop school. She hadn't interned at some avant-garde Paris label or posted viral design threads on X. She just had quiet talent, a sharp eye for authenticity, and a kindness that unsettled people who thrived on cruelty. She also wore the same 3 outfits most weeks, rotated. Always clean but never glamorous. The others noticed. It started on a Monday. The project manager passed out new pitch assignments, one to each creative. Harper's folder was thinner, fewer pages, smaller scope. At first she thought nothing of it, until she caught the assistant art director snorting softly. Later that day she overheard a conversation near the coffee machine. Someone whispered something about the charity hire. Another said cost-effective background filler. They didn't think she heard. She did. She said nothing. By Wednesday things got worse. The art team was presenting mock-ups in the main conference room. The new client was a Swiss luxury brand, leather goods and watches. High status, high stakes. Each designer had a board with their concepts, mounted and ready. When Harper rolled hers in, silence fell. Her board was handmade, no expensive print, no glow-edge LED frame. Just carefully arranged swatches, clean sketches, and a mood board printed from the office printer. Someone giggled. The creative director stared for a beat too long, then mumbled unexpected and moved on. But not before a guy near the back, Trevor, one of the junior strategists, leaned to his side and muttered something that made 3 people laugh under their breath. Harper stood there like she didn't hear it, but inside, it stung. Deep. The next day her keycard stopped working. She stood outside the glass door, pressing the card 3 times before one of the interns opened it from inside. They smiled politely, but behind them she saw 2 senior team members at their desks, watching. Not moving, not helping. In the break room her yogurt was gone, again. It was the 3rd time in a week, but this time someone left a sticky note in its place. 2 words written in black marker: upgrade taste. She stared at it for a moment, then crumpled it and dropped it in the bin. That afternoon she made the mistake of joining a group brainstorm uninvited. They were gathered near the whiteboard wall, tossing around buzzwords: metaverse immersion, aspirational sleekness, disruption with grace. Harper offered a quiet suggestion, just one. A different way to frame the story arc based on user experience. The group went quiet. Then Trevor laughed again. And this time he didn't whisper. He repeated her idea out loud, exaggerated, like a joke, and the whole team chuckled. Even the creative director smirked. Harper lowered her gaze and stepped back, pretending to look at her phone. That night she got home late. The loft was dim, only the hallway lamp was on. She dropped her keys on the entry table and sat down at the kitchen counter without speaking. From the study her husband appeared. He didn't speak at first either. He just watched her, watched how slowly she moved, how deliberately she placed her phone down, how she rubbed the side of her neck as if trying to push the day out of her skin. Then he asked if she was okay. She said yes, but he didn't believe her. Not even for a second. Her husband was never the loud type, never the flashy one in public. He wore quiet watches, spoke in simple sentences, and drove a car that cost less than most people's shoes in that office. But what most of them didn't know, what none of them knew, was that he owned a controlling stake in the agency, not under his name, of course. He kept that part of his life separate, silent. Harper never used his name as leverage, never hinted, never flashed his credentials. She wanted to earn her place. And so, for a long time, he stayed out of it, until that week. Until he saw her walk in 3 nights in a row, shoulders lower, eyes dimmer, voice quieter. Until he saw the kindness drain from her face one sigh at a time. Friday came, the day of the final pitch. Everyone was dressed sharp. Suits, tailored black dresses, watches glinting under glassy LED lights. The executive team had flown in from Zurich. The founder was even in the building, a rare presence. Harper wasn't invited to the pitch, not officially. She sat in the open workspace near the back, doing admin layout on a spec design while the others huddled inside the glass conference room. Trevor walked past her once and dropped a tissue box beside her keyboard. Just in case, he said. That was the moment. The one that would change everything. Because Harper didn't cry, she just picked up her phone and sent one message. The next time the elevator doors opened, the entire room turned. Because the man who stepped out didn't wear a badge, didn't announce himself. He walked in quietly. Straight past reception, past the copy station, through the open workspace. He was dressed simple. Black coat, dark shoes, no tie, but the look in his eyes, it carried weight. Even before anyone realized who he was, they moved, some stood, some froze. One junior assistant tried to stop him, but he simply raised his hand and the entire hallway paused like a command had been issued. And then, without raising his voice, he asked a question. "Where's my wife?" The sound of his voice moved through the office like a gust, not angry, not loud, but deliberate and unmistakably commanding. The kind of tone that didn't need to explain itself. The kind that made managers straighten up and interns hold their breath. No one answered right away. Until the creative director appeared from the glass-walled conference room, adjusting his cuffs, eyes flickering with polite confusion. He hadn't met the man before, not directly, but he'd seen the name on internal memos. And he understood one thing the moment their eyes met. This was not just someone's husband. This was the man who owned the building. Harper hadn't seen him yet. She was still at her desk, earbuds in, working on wireframe adjustments. She didn't know that the meeting had been paused. Didn't see how the team lead had discreetly slipped into the hallway to investigate the interruption. But what she did see, what made her finally look up, was the sound of shoes stopping beside her chair. He didn't speak right away. He just reached down, unplugged her second monitor and quietly said it was time to stand up. Not a request, not a favor, a decision. The silence behind her was thick now. All eyes were on them. Some of the staff tried to stay busy, typing without purpose, glancing at their screens while their peripheral vision stayed locked on the scene unfolding. Trevor stood frozen behind a coffee mug. One of the interns, the same one who had let her in earlier that week, was clutching a clipboard like a shield. The creative director opened his mouth as if to intervene, but didn't. Harper didn't argue. She didn't say a word. She just stood, slid her chair back under the desk, and picked up her worn canvas bag. The kind she'd brought every day since orientation. The one they'd made fun of on Slack behind her back. He placed a hand gently at the small of her back and guided her toward the front. The elevator dinged once, doors opened, but they didn't step inside, not yet. Instead, he turned around, faced the whole room, and calmly asked for one thing, an apology not just for Harper but for everything. The whispers, the sabotage, the exclusion, the cruelty disguised as culture. He said it not like a demand, but like a final invitation. Because the moment the elevator doors closed, that window would shut forever. The room didn't move. No one spoke. Trevor took half a step back. The art director stared at the floor. Even the founder, watching through the glass from the boardroom, said nothing, so the husband nodded once, as if confirming something to himself, and turned toward the elevator again. That's when the chaos began, not shouting but unraveling. The receptionist got a phone call from legal. HR was suddenly on alert. Messages were flying through Slack channels. Someone was told to double-check payroll authorization levels, because word had reached the top, the real top, and it wasn't just that Harper's husband had shown up. It was that he had the power to rewrite everything. Harper followed him out, still silent, still steady. She didn't look back once, but the people inside, they couldn't stop watching her leave. And for the first time all week, no one laughed. That night, the entire agency froze, emails stopped. Slack channels went silent. Rumors flooded the building. Some said the founder was being pushed out. Others said the firm's name would be changed by Monday. What was true? Only this: a list had been requested, a list of names, not of everyone who worked there, but everyone who had stood by, everyone who had watched. Because in a company like that, silence was participation. The weekend passed like a countdown. By Monday morning, 3 executives had cleared their offices before the first meeting. By noon, 3 mid-level team members were locked out of their accounts, but the part no one saw coming. Harper walked back in, not as staff as board member. She didn't wear heels. She didn't bring security. She walked into the same office, same hallway, same scent of expensive coffee and sterile ambition, wearing the same soft flats and same canvas bag. Only now, her badge didn't say creative contributor. It said board access. The receptionist stood when she approached, so did the junior intern, but Harper didn't pause. She walked to the glass meeting room, the one she'd never been invited to before, and opened the door without knocking. Half the room turned pale when they saw her. She took a seat at the head of the table. Her husband sat beside her, not as a guest. As the man whose signature now owned 72% of the agency, the founder, red-eyed and shaken, sat across from them, and for the first time the power had shifted. The meeting wasn't loud. There was no yelling, no threats, just decisions, clear ones, policies reviewed, roles reevaluated. Staff reshuffled, names removed, and when they got to the part about cultural realignment, Harper only said one sentence: "We don't hire cruelty anymore." By Tuesday, every member of the staff had been asked to submit a statement, not about qualifications, about ethics, behavior, integrity. Treatment of peers, some fumbled, some were honest, some had already packed their desks before the email went out, but the ones who stayed, they remembered everything, because what they saw that week, what they witnessed, would reshape the entire company culture forever. But Harper didn't gloat. She didn't make speeches or write takedown posts. She got to work. She redesigned the internship program to include mentorship. She restructured the breakroom culture, removing the so-called status fridge and turning it into a shared kitchen. And she personally responded to every email from junior designers, even the quiet ones. 1 month later, the company's client retention had improved. The press got wind of the restructuring, and instead of scandal, they found something rare: an industry giant publicly admitting its flaws and changing for the better. But that wasn't the story Harper cared about. She cared about the quiet girl who got hired next. The one with the nervous eyes and a passion for sustainable packaging design. Harper made sure she got the mentorship she never had. Tell me, have you ever seen a workplace turn on someone, only to realize too late who they really were? Drop your story in the comments below. You never know who might be reading. The office had changed. Not entirely, not yet, but the shift was visible in the air. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was careful. People still walked the halls with purpose, but their eyes no longer darted past each other like strangers on a train. Desks once separated by unspoken hierarchy now saw quiet collaboration. Even the coffee machine chatter had softened. The sarcasm had been drained from it, and for those who had survived the first wave of restructuring, they walked like people who had been spared but understood the lesson. Harper returned on Wednesday morning. No cameras, no press, just the same cardigan, the same flats, the same faded canvas bag resting on her shoulder. But this time, no one dared whisper when she walked by, not because they feared her, but because they remembered what silence had cost them the first time. The founder's name had been removed from the front wall, subtle, quiet. One day it was there, silver on black glass. The next, it was just Leon again. No surname, no signature. He still had a stake in the company, but the decisions no longer passed through him. That belonged to Harper and the board now. More importantly, the culture she created began to spread in small but permanent ways. She started with the interns. Before, they were used like background noise, running errands, printing decks, taking blame. Now they were treated as contributors. Harper personally sat with each one and reviewed their portfolios, not as a lecture but as a conversation. One of them, a quiet boy named Marcus with trembling hands, confessed he almost quit during his first week. Not because of the work, but because of the way the creative team spoke about people like him. Harper listened, and then she handed him her old desk. Across the office, the power structure cracked. Trevor had been reassigned, not fired but stripped of strategy roles. His desk was moved to a neutral bullpen. No private Slack channels. No access to internal culture meetings. He didn't smirk anymore, at least not publicly. But the discomfort on his face when Harper walked into a room, that part hadn't changed, and Harper never acknowledged it, never raised her chin or looked for revenge. She didn't need to. The space did it for her. But while the office was transforming, the deeper shift was happening in private in her. Harper had spent years trying to fit in, not to impress, just to avoid notice. She'd worn safe colors, chosen silence over challenge, and kept her head down long enough to be mistaken for someone with nothing to say. But now, her posture was different. She spoke in meetings without hesitating. She questioned decisions without flinching, not because of her title, but because she finally understood something painful and permanent. Her humility had once protected her from ego, but it had also hidden her from herself. That Friday, she took the subway home, not because she had to, but because she liked it. Same route, same people, same soft rhythm of tired strangers in quiet motion. But this time, someone recognized her. A girl, maybe early 20s, holding a cracked phone and a canvas sketchpad, locked eyes with Harper near the corner seat. She didn't speak, didn't ask for a selfie, just nodded slowly like she knew. Harper nodded back, and in that quiet moment the city felt smaller. Over the weekend, Harper met with the board. Some members wanted to restore the firm's image through press campaigns. Others suggested pushing Harper forward, making her the face of reform. She declined both. Her strategy was simpler: fix the inside and the outside would follow. By Monday, she had written a new hiring directive. No more nepotism. No more culture fit tests disguised as personality screenings. No more backchannel bias. She created a blind portfolio review system. Resumes were stripped of names, schools, and job titles. Only the work spoke. The first round of hires under this system included a self-taught designer from Nairobi, a mother of 3 who freelanced between school runs, and a neurodivergent strategist who used color-coded maps instead of bullet points. Each one brilliant. Each one previously invisible to the old gatekeepers. And while this new team reshaped campaigns from the ground up, Harper quietly rewrote the company's values. No plaques, no slogans, just policies. And those did more than any elevator pitch. But for all the growth, there were still shadows. The founder, though publicly cooperative, had started making quiet calls. Old clients, investors, rival firms. He hadn't forgiven what happened, and he still believed Harper's influence was temporary. That eventually the board would turn back, that the agency would return to what it was: sleek, ruthless, and filtered through elitism. What he didn't realize was that the board hadn't chosen Harper for optics. They chose her because she built value, real value. The kind that couldn't be bought, only trusted. By mid-month, a new client campaign launched: sustainability, accessibility. A sharp, emotional tone, but clean. It went viral in 2 hours, not because of a celebrity partnership, but because it told the truth. It was the first ad from Leon that had no filters, no over-designed pretense, and it made the industry stop and stare. At the next board review, Harper sat at the head again. Same calm, same posture, same silence before she spoke. But this time, when she laid down the quarterly numbers, even the skeptics had nothing to say. Revenue up, employee retention doubled, client trust stronger than ever, and one key line stood out: this is what happens when people feel safe enough to stay. That day, someone sent Harper a photo. It was from months ago, before the shift. She was sitting at her old desk, back hunched slightly, shoulders small, canvas bag leaning against the leg of the chair. Behind her, slightly out of frame, were 3 coworkers laughing. She stared at the photo for a long time, not in anger, but in gratitude, because it reminded her of the moment she'd almost disappeared, and the reason she didn't. The next morning she came in early, before the lights, before the noise. And for the first time in a long time, she sat alone in the kitchen with a quiet cup of tea and felt peace, not pride, not power, just peace. And for someone who had once been laughed out of a brainstorm, that peace was more than enough. Have you ever worked somewhere that made you question your worth, only to find out you had more power than they imagined? Share it in the comments. People need your story. Monday morning brought a stillness the office hadn't known before. Not silence, not tension, but steadiness. Like the kind that settles over a storm's aftermath. Like people realizing the foundation had held, but the roof needed rebuilding. People showed up earlier now, not out of fear, but because there was momentum in the air. Clients were returning calls faster. Submissions were cleaner. Even the elevators moved differently, as if sensing that whatever had poisoned the system was finally being purged. But Harper knew better than to trust first impressions, because rot doesn't always die in sunlight. Sometimes it hides under a different face, and that week it wore a smile. On Wednesday, the founder returned from his retreat. He arrived mid-morning, flanked by two senior consultants, neither of whom had set foot in the building since the reorganization. They didn't ask to join the team huddle. They didn't pause to greet staff. They walked directly into the strategy wing, closed the glass doors behind them, and requested access to executive reports. No permission, just assumption. Harper was in a meeting across the floor when the notification pinged her tablet. Two back-end credential requests flagged as unauthorized. Within seconds, she stood up, walked across the workspace, and entered the strategy wing without knocking. The room fell silent. She didn't raise her voice. She simply revoked the login requests and asked what they were looking for. The founder smiled thinly. He said it was a routine audit. A formality, nothing to worry about, but Harper wasn't listening to his words. She was watching his hands, the way they gestured too wide, too slow. The way he avoided looking at the newer team members now seated near the windows. She knew what this was, not sabotage, a test. He wanted to see how far her reach really went. That afternoon, she held a closed-door session with legal, not to fire anyone, but to finalize something she'd been designing behind the scenes, an internal code, not just a list of HR rules. A structural doctrine that rewrote how decision-making authority flowed through the company, one that ensured no single name, not even hers, could override team-based ethics. It was the opposite of what the founder had built. His model was vertical. Harper's was layered, more deliberate. Harder to exploit. By Thursday, the changes were live. The board approved unanimously. The founder wasn't removed, but he was contained, and he knew it. Back on the main floor, the creative team had changed too. The smugness that used to flow like cologne had been replaced with a kind of quiet energy, people trying again, not because of pressure, but because it finally felt safe to do so. Even Trevor had changed his seat, no longer near the board. He now sat closer to the interns, blending in like background static. He still carried a steel tumbler with his initials engraved, but the way he drank from it was different now, cautious, like he knew how easily things could be emptied. Later that week, Harper stayed late, not to work, to walk. She moved through the quiet hallways like someone returning to a place they used to fear. Each room, each desk, each window had once held weight. Now they were lighter, familiar. In the old break room, she found something unexpected, a sticky note on the fridge. It didn't say much. Just 4 words written in plain ink: sorry, you deserved better. No name, no clue who left it, but she smiled just faintly and folded it into her pocket. Because apologies weren't always public, and sometimes they didn't need to be. Friday arrived with news. The international client Harper had onboarded during the transition, the one everyone had doubted, announced a full campaign renewal, not just a contract extension. Rebrand, handled entirely by Harper's newly assembled team. The announcement hit trade publications before lunch. Headlines didn't mention the founder. They didn't mention the reorganization. They focused on one thing: how an overlooked strategist built a campaign that redefined the client's global identity from the inside. Her name trended briefly on LinkedIn, and she never posted a word. That evening, as the office cleared out, Harper stayed behind again. She liked the quiet. It reminded her of who she'd been before all of this, the girl with the canvas bag and 3 rotating outfits, trying to matter in a room designed to ignore her. Now, she sat in that same room. Only the table had turned, and in her hand she held a letter not addressed to her, but one she'd found slipped into her desk drawer. It wasn't an apology, it was a confession from an anonymous employee about how they'd joined the jokes early on, laughed, stayed silent, looked away. Not because they hated her, but because they feared being the next target. The letter ended with one sentence: "You made us brave." The next morning, Harper visited the old branch office. It was where she'd started before being transferred to HQ, smaller, quieter. But it held the spirit she'd always believed in, the sense that people mattered more than polish. She met with the local team, reviewed their policies, brought gifts for the office manager who once snuck her lunch during unpaid overtime hours, and before leaving, she left behind something else. A letter of her own, A simple message taped to the door inside the kitchen. What you build quietly echoes loudly. By Sunday, the founder called a private board meeting. He requested a discussion about long-term leadership succession. But Harper saw through it. It wasn't about succession. It was a chess move, an attempt to paint her role as temporary, to stir uncertainty in the board's direction. What he didn't expect, the board declined his request before the meeting even began, not with hostility, with confidence, because the numbers didn't lie. Neither did the culture reports, and neither did the employees who now walked the halls without fear. The founder left that day without another word. He didn't show up Monday. His office was empty by Wednesday, and by Friday his nameplate was gone, not replaced, just gone. In the weeks that followed, Harper never brought up his absence. She focused on hiring, mentorship, restructuring the outdated systems that had kept so many talented people on the outside. And though she remained calm in every meeting, everyone knew what she had done, not by force. By standards, by kindness strong enough to bend steel. Have you ever seen a quiet person rebuild something stronger than the people who broke it? Tell us below. Stories like that remind us why we fight for better. When Harper arrived Monday morning, there was no crowd waiting, no red carpet, no surprise banners, just an email already in her inbox, a short message from legal. The final paperwork confirming full transfer of controlling interest had been executed. The founder was now just a former name on an outdated filing cabinet, and the firm he'd once ruled with curated cruelty no longer carried his legacy. The building was the same, but the soul had changed, and now it was time to plant something new. She started where most executives never bothered to look, the back end, not operations but atmosphere, the way junior creatives were briefed, the way interns were paired with leads, the way conference rooms were used and who had access to speaking time. She made unspoken barriers visible, then dismantled them. She created rotation tracks between departments, not to confuse titles but to cross-pollinate value. A strategist now spent 1 hour a week inside the design room. A graphic lead could sit in a data meeting. Even the janitorial crew was invited to weigh in on environmental layout improvements. To outsiders, it seemed excessive. To insiders, it changed everything. People saw each other now, not just their titles. But not everyone was ready. Trevor, despite the silence he'd worn since the reshuffle, still hadn't left the building. He clocked in. He joined calls. He nodded in meetings. But his contribution remained empty, a shell of presence without humility or growth. He hadn't apologized. He hadn't acknowledged. He simply endured. And Harper watched this carefully, not because she wanted to punish him, but because every culture carries shadows and sometimes they wear suits and stay quiet, waiting for the weather to change again. She needed to know whether his silence was regret or strategy. On Wednesday, a new designer joined. Her name was Mina, soft-spoken, hijab wrapped in earthy olive tones. Her resume had been passed over twice under the old system, but Harper's blind portfolio system gave her a voice. She arrived with her own stylus, her own sketchpad, and zero fear. In her first presentation, she laid out a storyboard concept that blended rural textiles with metropolitan tech branding. The room froze, not out of discomfort but out of realization. She saw angles no one else had, and when she left the room, Harper heard murmurs, not envy, not sarcasm. Curiosity. Finally, later that day, Harper caught Trevor watching Mina, not with disdain but with something closer to hunger, the kind of stare that didn't belong in a workplace. The kind that said nothing out loud but made your spine shift. She didn't react then. She waited. She spoke with Mina that evening, casually, gently. Mina hadn't noticed anything yet, but Harper had, and she would not let history repeat itself. The following morning, HR received a quiet directive. A compliance officer would now attend all mixed department briefings where Trevor was present. A seat change was logged. A subtle shift in team flow followed. Trevor, for the first time in months, requested a private meeting. He asked why. Harper told him she was simply making room for talent. The way he blinked twice before answering, that was confirmation enough. The next client pitch arrived on Friday, a major sustainability brand. Their old strategy had leaned too heavily on performance stats. Harper's new team, including Mina, pitched something else entirely: emotion, human-centered design. They framed sustainability not as data but as love for family, for future, for soil. The campaign structure used real people, real voices, real fears. It didn't dazzle, it resonated. The client paused after the pitch, then approved it in full, right there. No revisions, no second round, just a handshake, and a stare directly at Harper when they said the words. This is what branding is supposed to feel like. That weekend, Harper visited the place where it had all started, not the office. The cafe across the street from her first job, before Leon, before the ridicule, before the promotions that never came. She sat at her old table near the window, sipping mint tea, watching the street. The city looked the same, fast, ruthless, shiny, but now it no longer scared her. She didn't want revenge on it, she just wanted to outlive the pain it once caused. And now she had. Monday returned with fire. The pitch campaign Harper's team launched had exploded online. Major news outlets called it the first real emotion-forward sustainability campaign since Patagonia. Industry leaders reposted the rollout deck. Even a former Leon board member reached out privately, not to congratulate, but to inquire if Harper would consult on his next venture. She didn't respond, not yet, because attention wasn't the goal, change was. But attention always brings pressure. By Wednesday, the press began poking. Some blogs dug into Leon's past scandals, especially the cultural rot under the previous regime. One reporter reached out anonymously, asking whether Harper had anything to say about being mocked, excluded, or humiliated before her husband's intervention. She declined the interview, then wrote a blog post herself, one that didn't mention names, didn't drag reputations, didn't posture. It simply told the story of what happens when a company stops asking who fits our mold and starts asking who can make us better. The post went viral, not in outrage, in inspiration, and the comments, they weren't about her power, they were about her presence. Friday, Harper walked into a board meeting where everyone stood when she entered, not protocol, respect. And the moment the meeting ended, one of the board members, an older, sharp-tongued woman who had once openly sided with the founder, walked over and said a single sentence, "You've made me reconsider everything I thought about leadership." No plaque, no bonus, just that. And it meant more than any stock option ever had. That evening, Harper stayed behind again. The lights dimmed slowly across the floor. She stood by the window, watched the street lights blur against the glass, and thought about the day she almost quit. The day someone laughed at her portfolio board and someone else stole her lunch and left a sticky note about upgrading taste. She still remembered their faces. But now they no longer haunted her, they taught her, and without knowing it, they'd made her impossible to break. Ever been underestimated by everyone in the room, only to become the one they eventually answer to? Share it below. Let's turn pain into blueprints. The building looked different now, not the structure, the feeling. Where there was once static, there was hum. Where people once walked stiff-backed and filtered, now they moved like they belonged. The elevator that used to carry dread now felt like an invitation. And Harper, she moved through it all like the architect of air. She didn't need to command the room anymore. Because the room had already been rebuilt in her image. But impact has a quiet price. It doesn't always ask for payment in fame or applause. Sometimes it asks for energy. Harper found herself staying later, rising earlier, carrying more than she let on. Not because she felt obligated, but because she knew how fragile change was when built on fresh ground. She still remembered the first 3 weeks after her hiring, how one joke had unraveled her confidence for days. How a group Slack thread calling her cardigan culture circulated behind her back. She'd kept it to herself then. Now she used it, not for revenge but for design. Every leadership module she approved had empathy at its center. Every mentorship initiative included a story circle. Every evaluation encouraged not just performance reviews, but peer treatment audits. She wasn't just rebuilding workflows, she was rewriting worth. On Wednesday, the newest intern made a mistake, a small one. A mislabeled draft sent early to a client. Before, this would have been a bloodbath. Raised voices, passive-aggressive jokes, public shaming during the Friday recap. But now, Harper stepped in before it escalated. She called a pause, walked the team through a quiet correction process, and then asked a single question. What do we learn when failure is safe? The room didn't answer out loud, but every person leaned forward. That was enough. Friday came with celebration, not of profit, of people. A surprise awards ceremony was hosted in the break room. No titles, just recognition. Each honoree got a handwritten card from 3 coworkers, plus an anonymous letter from someone they'd helped without realizing. Harper watched from the corner, sipping tea, eyes quiet with observation. And when Mina, the designer who had once almost stayed invisible, received the longest applause of the afternoon, Harper finally exhaled, because that clap wasn't for design, it was for dignity. But peace, like glass, is always waiting for a test. And that test arrived the following Tuesday, in the form of an email, not to Harper, to the board, a formal acquisition offer from one of the largest firms in the industry, backed by venture capital and dressed in gold. The offer was aggressive, flattering, and threatening all at once. They wanted Leon, they wanted Harper, but not her culture, not her code. They offered full purchase, and requested she transition out within 6 months to allow brand recalibration. The board called an emergency session. Some were tempted. The offer was obscene, triple market valuation, guaranteed bonuses, long-term shares. For anyone still driven by ego or numbers, it was a dream. But for Harper, it was the old world knocking again in a better suit. She requested one day, not to stall, to think. She needed time to feel it, because decisions made too quickly can carry invisible cracks. She left the office that night with no briefcase, no laptop, just her husband waiting by the car, sensing something had shifted. They didn't speak on the ride home, didn't need to. Because some crossroads announce themselves by silence, not signs. That night, Harper stayed awake. She remembered her first paycheck, how it barely covered rent but still made her feel like she was moving forward. She remembered the smirks, the elevator whispers, the days her name was left off decks she built from scratch. And then she remembered the sticky note, the anonymous letter, the intern's eyes when he realized someone believed in his potential. And she knew this place wasn't hers to sell. It was hers to protect. The next morning she returned early, first one in. She walked to the boardroom and placed a letter on each chair, not a resignation, a vote. Inside she outlined 2 paths: 1, sell, profit, exit, go down as a short-term legend with a high price tag; 2, stay, build, endure, and give the world something it's running out of: companies with a soul. She didn't campaign, she didn't beg, she let the words speak. When the board arrived, they sat in silence. Each opened the letter, each read at their own pace. No one spoke for 17 minutes. Then the chairwoman, the same woman who once doubted her, closed her letter, looked up and simply nodded. The others followed. Unanimous. The offer was declined, not with fury, with peace, because they knew they were sitting on something greater than capital. They were sitting inside a legacy that hadn't even fully bloomed yet. The acquisition firm sent a cold response, accusations of short-sightedness, warnings about market trends. But Harper didn't flinch. She just went back to work, because storms that loud rarely last, and roots that deep don't bend for wind. That week, Harper launched the final internal program of her vision. It was simple. Every employee was assigned a mirror match, someone in a different department, different background, but same level of responsibility. For 1 hour each week they met, not to strategize, not to work, to listen, to understand, to humanize the invisible parts of each other's labor. And within 1 month, performance metrics rose. But more importantly, trust rose. People no longer just collaborated, they belonged. Have you ever had to choose between wealth and integrity, between what looks good and what feels right? Drop your moment in the comments. The rest of us might need to hear it. By the end of that quarter, something strange began to happen. Competitors started watching Leon. Not just watching, mimicking. A boutique agency in San Diego quietly introduced mirror mentorships. A branding firm in Boston launched a stripped-down hiring process focused on anonymous portfolios. But none of it had the same heartbeat, because they were copying the form, not the foundation. Harper didn't flinch when she saw the headlines. She didn't chase credit. She didn't issue statements. She just showed up, calm as ever, cardigan sleeves slightly pushed, tea in hand, eyes clear, because her power wasn't in noise, it was in presence. But while others were watching her from outside, Harper had her eye on something else: the middle, not the interns, not the executives, the middle. That stretch of talent often ignored, the quietly competent, the overlooked engine of every company, the ones passed over for promotions because they didn't shout in meetings or drink with the board. She saw them, she remembered them, because she was them. She launched a new initiative that month. No press release, no buzzwords, just one line in the weekly internal memo. If you've ever felt invisible, your moment is coming. And it did. Over 40 mid-level team members received anonymous nominations from peers and project leads, citing quiet excellence, emotional labor, problem-solving in the shadows. No rankings, no ceremony, just handwritten notes placed on desks, real words from real people. And for some of them, it was the first time they'd ever felt seen. Then came the gala, not her idea, the board had planned it. The 5-year global branding milestone, champagne, suits, velvet ropes, everything Harper used to avoid. But this time, she walked in head held high, no stylist, no entourage, just the same canvas clutch, the same braid down her back. And as she entered, conversations paused, not because she demanded it, because people remembered. They remembered who she used to be and who she chose to become without ever raising her voice. The founder didn't attend, but his shadow did. A rival firm, one he now advised, sent representatives, polished smiles, faux warmth, polite condescension dressed as networking. One of them made the mistake of approaching Harper mid-evening. A casual joke, something about how the building looked nicer now that it had curtains and kindness. He expected a laugh. He got eye contact, still, unshaken. And then silence. That silence said everything, not rejection. Not contempt, just dismissal. The kind that only people with nothing left to prove can deliver. But the real moment of the night wasn't Harper's entrance. It was the wall. Toward the back of the venue, behind the stage, near the exit, the team had built a wall of stories. Anonymous quotes, messages, paragraphs printed on soft parchment paper, pinned gently in a sweeping arc. Each one was a moment someone at Leon had felt human again. One was from the janitor, another from an intern's mother. One simply read, "I didn't quit because someone said hi in the hallway. That was enough." And at the center of the arc, one final quote, pinned in black ink, "When dignity becomes policy, everything changes." No one had to guess who wrote it. Harper didn't speak that night, no mic, no toast. But when the gala ended and the ballroom emptied, she stayed back for 5 minutes, just her and the wall, reading every piece, not smiling, not crying, just honoring, because she knew every word on that wall had once been a heartbeat buried in silence. Now it had space. Back in the office the next week, Harper quietly finalized a long-planned move. She'd designed it months ago but waited for the right moment. Now it was time. She stepped down, not out, up. She moved herself to an executive creative advisory role, no direct team oversight, no desk. Just vision, the daily operations, handed to 3 leaders she'd mentored quietly, all of them women, 2 of them once ridiculed, all of them survivors. The transition wasn't flashy. It didn't need to be. Her fingerprints were already built into the architecture of the company. Now she was free to do what she always wanted, build beyond it. That same week, she declined a Forbes profile. They wanted a headline. How one woman rebuilt a broken culture. She gave them a quote instead. "I didn't rebuild it. I just made space for the right people to breathe." Later that night, she returned to the cafe, same seat, same tea, same window, but this time she brought something new, a notebook. Inside it were sketches, not logos, not strategies, blueprints. She was building something again, not another company, not another brand. Something quieter. A program for girls like she used to be, overlooked, mocked, brilliant. A space where they could learn how to own the rooms that once tried to erase them. She called it Project Canvas, and she didn't need funding. She just needed faith. Have you ever turned the pain they gave you into a plan? Ever taken mockery and built something they'd never understand? Tell me in the comments. Someone reading might be waiting for your map. The first session of Project Canvas took place on a cloudy Saturday morning. No press. No social media, just a rented hall with folding chairs, handwritten name tags, and a whiteboard so clean it still smelled like packaging. Harper stood at the front, not behind a podium, just in front of it. 12 women sat quietly, most of them under 30, all of them carrying that same heavy awareness in their eyes, that they had talent, and that somewhere, someone had made them doubt it. She didn't introduce herself with a resume. She started with a question. What was the first room that made you feel small? And then she let silence answer. One by one, hands went up, not to impress, to confess. A conference room where someone laughed during their pitch. A faculty meeting where their research was quoted but not credited. A studio where the client stared at their body before hearing their ideas. By the end of the first hour, the room was breathing together, not louder, just deeper, and Harper. She never corrected them, never offered advice. She just listened, because space is what she'd needed once, and now she could offer it back. The program wasn't structured like a school. There were no grades, no modules, just experiences. One week they practiced saying no without apology. Another, they sat in silence for 5 minutes after being interrupted, to teach the room what their absence would feel like. Each exercise was deliberate, not flashy, just surgical. And the more the women opened up, the more they began to unlearn the crouch they'd been trained to live in. Meanwhile, back at Leon, the company thrived without Harper's daily presence, which was the point. She hadn't built a throne, she'd built a system. One of the new leads, Jordan, the strategist who once cried in a stairwell after a failed pitch, had just led a multi-million-dollar global campaign and received a thank you letter from a CEO who said it was the first time he'd ever felt moved by data. That mattered more than a bonus. Because it meant the work had grown a heart. But peace doesn't stay untouched forever. 3 months into Project Canvas, Harper received an email from a name she hadn't seen in over a year, Trevor. The subject line was just her name. Inside, an invitation. He was launching a firm. He wanted her to consult, said she'd been an inspiration, said she had a gift for building things. But Harper had learned how to read between the polish. What he really meant was, I see what you built. I want a piece. She didn't reply, but she didn't delete it either. She archived it. Because not all poison needs to be fought. Some of it just needs to be kept out of reach. Week 8 of Project Canvas introduced an unexpected test. One of the youngest women, a shy coder named Eliza, broke down mid-session. Not from pressure, from praise. Harper had pointed out how clearly her architecture diagrams told a story, how her logic paths mirrored narrative arcs. The comment was simple, but for Eliza it hit like thunder, because no one had ever said it like that before. Her hands had been taught to type, not to speak. Now they were shaking. Harper walked over, said nothing, and sat beside her for 5 minutes. And in that moment, Eliza didn't become a star. She became a seed. And sometimes that's the difference. Back in the city, whispers began surfacing about a new agency rising, one that promised old-school clarity with modern polish. Harper knew what that meant. The founder was back, not in her building, but in her orbit. He teamed up with a foreign equity group, bought a minority share in an aging creative firm, and started recruiting the disillusioned. And sure enough, he reached out to 3 of Leon's mid-levels. Only one responded. And even she came back to Harper the next day, eyes nervous but steady, and told her everything. Not to confess, to ask, did I do the right thing by staying? Harper didn't answer. She just pointed to the wall behind her. The one lined with sticky notes, sketches, and quotes from everyone who had stayed. The answer was already there. Then came the press leak. A niche media outlet published a hit piece, accused Leon of performative equity. Said their leadership shuffle was an optic stunt driven by marital power, not merit. Didn't name Harper directly, but they didn't have to. Everyone knew the article was bitter, precise, laced with quotes from anonymous industry veterans. The founder's fingerprints were invisible, but not undetectable. Harper didn't fight it publicly, but inside she moved with clarity. She called a full team meeting, not mandatory, just invited. More than 90% showed up. She didn't defend the firm. She didn't correct the article. She did something stranger. She pulled up a slideshow of failures, miscalculated drafts, missed deadlines, early branding concepts that had been terrible. Then she showed their revisions, each one, and slowly the room began to smile, because what she was showing wasn't just work. She was showing evolution. That's how you kill a smear campaign, not with noise, with memory. The next week, something beautiful happened. One of the original Canvas women, Naomi, a sculptor turned UI designer, landed a job at a top studio, not because of referrals, because her work finally felt like hers. She sent Harper a package. Inside, a clay figure, a woman standing with arms stretched, not in victory but in invitation. No words, just a note. You made it okay to stand here. Harper kept it on her desk, right next to the tea mug with the chipped handle, because scars didn't bother her anymore. They just meant something had been used. Have you ever walked away from someone who once had power over you and realized they never earned it to begin with? Tell your story below. We read every single one. The following month brought invitations, not to meetings, to panels, Talks, awards, every leadership summit wanted Harper now. Every industry magazine wanted a feature. She was called a disruptor, a quiet visionary, a soft strategist with iron standards. But she declined almost all of them, not out of spite, because she'd already done what they were trying to celebrate, and she didn't need applause for what she built when no one was clapping. Instead, she gave her time to something quieter. A city grant had just been approved for underrepresented founders. Harper anonymously funded the legal team that helped write the policy. She didn't add her name. She didn't post about it. But when the proposal passed, she attended the vote from the back of the room, eyes calm, sleeves rolled, watching a new table get built where the old doors had always been locked. Project Canvas had grown too. What started with 12 women now had over 70. Some were first-gen college grads. Some were former teachers who left burnt out. Some were survivors of rooms that never apologized. All of them were building something, not with rage but with remodeling. And Harper watched it unfold like she was watching old wounds knit themselves shut without fanfare, just fiber. But not everyone was clapping. That rival agency, the one quietly backed by the former founder, had launched its campaign. It mimicked Harper's tone. It mimicked her visuals, but it couldn't mimic her values, because when the pressure hit, they cracked. One of their junior staffers, a young copywriter named Reese, leaked emails to the press, messages mocking emotion-forward campaigns, messages that labeled clients by skin tone, messages that ranked employees' brand value by social metrics. The fallout was swift. A campaign was pulled. 2 leads were suspended, and once again the industry remembered the difference between looking kind and being built kind. Still, Harper didn't speak on it. She didn't tweet. She didn't gloat. She just sent Reese a short, private message through mutual connections. Not a job offer. Just a note: your right to protect your voice. Never let them tell you silence is maturity. Back at Leon, things were changing in a different way, not louder, wider. The Canvas women had begun hosting satellite groups, using Harper's models, her lessons, her frameworks, but adding their own lived experiences. The curriculum adapted. New voices stepped forward, and slowly, Harper began stepping further back, not because she was tired, because she was done hoarding the mic. On a cold Tuesday morning, Harper visited the old Leon building, the one she used to walk into with her head slightly bowed, hoping no one would mention her outfit or ask who let her into the meeting. It had been sold, renovated. Now it was a startup co-working hub, but the receptionist recognized her. She didn't say anything, just smiled and held the door a little longer. Inside, Harper walked the old hallway. She paused near the second-floor window where she once sat during lunch, pretending to scroll while fighting off tears. Now she stood there upright. And then she did something strange. She sat again. Same spot, same window, same world. Only this time she didn't feel like an outsider looking in. She felt like a lighthouse watching over a shore she no longer needed to dock at. Then came the letter, handwritten. No stamp, delivered through the Leon front desk. No return address. But she recognized the handwriting before she even unfolded the paper. It was the founder, the man who once claimed she didn't know how to command a room, now writing on a piece of paper because no microphone would take him seriously anymore. The letter wasn't angry. It wasn't even bitter. It was tired. He spoke of loss, of regret, of not understanding what culture meant until it collapsed under him, and he ended with a sentence she didn't expect. They respected me because they feared me, but they follow you because they believe in you. She didn't write back. There was nothing left to exchange, because what he'd finally realized was something she'd known for years. Reputation is rented. Integrity is owned. That Friday, she gave her last in-person lecture at Project Canvas, not because the program was ending, because it no longer needed her at the front. She sat in the back. Let Naomi lead. Let Eliza facilitate. Let 3 new voices carry the session forward with power, calm, and conviction. And when they ended with a quote that once lived on the original Canvas wall, Harper smiled softly and stood, not to speak, to leave. Because some victories don't need fireworks, they just need completion. The city skyline blinked quietly outside as she walked alone. No driver, no entourage, just her keys and her clutch. As she passed by a coffee cart, someone tapped her shoulder, a stranger, young, nervous. They asked if she was Harper Lane. She nodded gently. They said she'd changed their life, not directly, but because someone they trusted had shown them Harper's story. And suddenly they'd stopped asking, "How do I fit in?" and started asking, "What do I want to build?" She thanked them, warmly, quietly, then walked on, because validation, while sweet, was no longer necessary. What she needed now was rest. Has someone ever tried to rewrite your worth, only to watch you write something greater? Let us know in the comments. Your story might become someone else's reason to keep going. It started with a message, a quiet ping from a new number. An invitation, handwritten, scanned, and attached digitally. The envelope bore no return address. The signature at the bottom was unfamiliar, but the logo, that was unmistakable. The same firm that once mocked Harper for her cardigan, questioned her silence, and called her decorative, now inviting her to be the keynote speaker at their upcoming leadership summit. Theme: redefining authority. She didn't respond right away. She went on a walk instead. No destination, no earbuds, just wind, gravel, and time. She passed the bench where she used to rehearse client pitches to herself, repeating lines under her breath like spells she hoped would make her visible. She passed the alley behind the cafe, where she once cried into a napkin while pretending she had something in her eye. And when she looped back toward the city's west side, she realized something. She wasn't walking through her past. She was walking over it, like roots pressing through old concrete. 3 days later, she responded. She wouldn't take the keynote, but she would send someone else. Naomi, the sculptor turned creative lead from Project Canvas, not a placeholder, a torchbearer. The organizers pushed back. They offered to fly Harper first class, pay double. She didn't budge, because the era of making herself smaller to fit rooms had ended. Now, she made the rooms fit the future. Instead, Harper stayed home that weekend. She sat beside her husband in the sunroom, their fingers tangled, no phones between them. They talked about nothing and everything. How weird success feels when it's no longer something you chase, but something you live inside quietly. How silence doesn't mean absence, it means arrival. And how love, when built in struggle, doesn't fade with ease, it gets quieter but stronger, like a steel beam behind a paper wall. Later that evening, Harper opened a drawer she hadn't touched in years. Inside, her first rejection letter, the one that said she was too emotionally reactive to lead branding discussions. She read it once, then smiled, and without dramatics she placed it in the shredder. Not out of revenge, out of release, because she no longer needed reminders of who she'd been told to be. She was already proof of who she became. Leon continued to thrive. The company had launched a new vertical, dedicated to social storytelling, featuring narratives from grassroots campaigns and underrepresented voices. Mina led it. The woman who once stood in the background, now directing major national campaigns, and mentoring her own team through the same empathy Harper once showed her. And when the firm won a humanitarian award for design equity, the acceptance speech didn't mention Harper. And that's exactly what made it beautiful. She hadn't built a statue. She'd planted a forest. Back at Project Canvas, something new was forming, not under Harper's hand, under Eliza's. The quiet coder had been prototyping a platform, one where women could share leadership lessons, portfolio insights, and workplace red flags anonymously, a hybrid of safety and education. She pitched it during week 21. The room went still, not in confusion, in awe. Harper watched from the side, not as a coach but as a witness, because sometimes the highest form of leadership is leaving space. Then came the documentary. A filmmaker who'd shadowed Project Canvas for months released a short film called The Women Who Stayed. It featured no narration. Just faces, fragments, first names, stories whispered in stairwells and shouted in resignation letters. Harper appeared only once from behind, just a silhouette by a window, watching the group run their session without her. The comments section flooded, not with applause, with recognition. People didn't just see her, they saw themselves. She was invited to the premiere. She didn't go. She stayed home, watered her plants, then opened the notebook again. Inside, sketches of a cabin, a retreat center for creative rest, no Wi-Fi, just firewood, pencil sharpeners, and a library. A place for women to write what they'd never been allowed to say. She circled the name at the top, Hollow Light, named after what people used to call her, all look, no force. Now, it was a promise. Even the quietest glow could reshape darkness. On the first official day of fall, Harper walked past Leon headquarters on her way to meet Naomi for lunch. The windows shimmered with new project posters. The receptionist had changed. The air was lighter. But as she stepped past the entrance, one intern, young, sharp-eyed, opened the door for her without hesitation. She thanked him. He smiled, then said something that stayed in her chest for days. "I know who you are. You don't need a badge." That night, Harper took a deep breath on her balcony. Below her, the city pulsed with its usual rhythm: cars, laughter, sirens, neon. But inside, stillness, the kind only earned through fire. She sat down, opened a fresh notebook, and wrote 5 words: "It was never about me." Then closed it, because that was the real victory, not revenge, not control, not even redemption, just the unshakable fact she had turned humiliation into a home. If you made it this far, tell us, what would you say to the version of yourself who almost gave up? Drop it in the comments. You never know who needs to hear it.